So, we're going to be hosting this event a little differently than your average webinar. We thought it'd be really cool to see this in a fishbowl method. And so what that means is essentially a round table discussion. And all of us get to sit back and be a fly on the wall on this epic conversation. So, there's just far too many opportunities for activists, journalists, and lawyers to be in the same space and just talk to one another on the same sphere that they all work in. And today we get that chance, and we're fortunate enough to be present of all of that brilliance. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Sabrina Dellon. You can spotlight her, please. And like I said, she is a Center for Dialogue Fellow and the Executive Director of the Samara Center for Democracy. And she is an experienced public sector leader with a proven track record of directing multi-stakeholder research and outreach initiatives across justice, academic, and nonprofit sectors. So thank you, Sabrina, for moderating this conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks, Adele. We are so fortunate to have such an incredible group of speakers with us today. I'm going to take a few minutes to introduce them in turn now. Halpakawit has been directly involved with Indigenous resistance for 3 decades. Her work has spanned every single area from organizing, filmmaking to training. She is Coasalish, Nuchanal, and Snanaima, a matriarch and author of the renowned Ancestral Pride Allyship zines. I just want to take a minute here in case my pronunciation needs correction.
Halpakawit is my name. Snuneymuch is the nation. Coasalish, you all know, and Nuchanals, which is the other side of the island. So I am Coasalish Nuchanals. Would you like me to introduce myself?
Yes, please.
Umakla Halpakawit. My name is given to me at birth, and I come from a long line of hereditary kings and queens and a family of very high status. I come from the House of Thunder and Lightning. My clan is the Earthquake clan. And I have a lot of history and cultural teachings that have been passed on to me through my family lineage, which has enabled me at a very young age to take up this work and to do what I do now today. Right now I'm working on residential schools and getting the documents released, as well as healing the elders and being able to facilitate them to tell their stories to Indigenous people who care and have this experience, rather than them sharing it with the news who are not giving them the respect that they're needed, and also confronting the racism that these institutions that are trying to hide the documents and hide the genocide, and to show them that, regardless, we need to bring these criminals to justice. And that's a huge piece of my work, and I'm really grateful that I have a platform where I'm able to share that with you guys. So thank you. Welcome to my territory. And I enjoy all of this discourse that's going to happen, because I know it's going to be great.
Thank you. Welcome. The next speaker I'll introduce is Elle Jones. Elle Jones is a community activist who's breaking ground on defining defunding the police. She's the chair of the subcommittee appointed by the Halifax Board of Police Commissioners. She was also Halifax's Poet Laureate from 2013 to 2015. Jennifer Taylor is a lawyer practicing civil litigation and co-wrote the independent legal opinion on street checks for the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission. She's a member of the Nova Scotia Policing Policy Working Group, and she's also providing research support to the subcommittee to define defunding police, working with Elle Jones. Meenakshi Mano is the criminalization and policing campaigner at Pivot Legal Society. She's trained as a social worker and has worked in health, community, and legal services. She also belongs to the Defund 604 Network and Vancouver Prison Justice Day Committee. Brandon Rowley has been the managing lawyer of the Halifax Youth Justice Office since 2017. He's co-chair of the Equity and Racial Diversity Committee within Nova Scotia Legal Aid, and is also a member of the Racial Equity Committee and Criminal Standards Committee within the Nova Scotia Barristers Society. And finally, last but not least, we have Alicia Hashem, who has covered courts, crime, and justice-related issues for the Toronto Star since 2014. She's a joint recipient of the 2021 Landsberg Award in recognition of stories addressing women's experiences of male violence. including police, workplace, sexual harassment. Welcome, everybody. Before we get started, I want to lay out some very basic context. Systemic racism, myths and misconceptions, underfunded legal aid. The problems with the criminal justice system are not new. The status quo is deeply entrenched, as this group of speakers knows all too well. So although the challenge of advancing meaningful change is still very much present, something seems to have shifted recently in the criminal justice conversation, as well as in the public's consciousness. So together today, we're going to explore what's possible in this current moment. And I have some questions for us, but absolutely encourage you all to jump in and pose questions to each other as well. This can absolutely be a conversation, it should be. But I will kick us off with a question about hope or questioning hope. And that is, what makes you optimistic at this moment?
I'm going to go ahead.
Sure.
So prior to this meeting going live, I was thinking about this, and what do we have to be optimistic for, I think is a better frame. Because right now, in terms of like the political climate that is happening in so-called Canada here, there's not a lot to be hopeful for. They're finding, thousands of bodies of children. That's directly impacting the rates of suicide and deaths in our communities. And Justin Trudeau is actively, fighting Indigenous children in court while we're finding the bodies of, our loved ones, which is also brought up like a highly racialized environment where you get people who are overly apologetic and it gets to be invasive of your space, right? Because they want to rectify these things. And then you get people who are just completely like, F you guys, get over it and move on. And so like the thing that I'm optimistic for is having more dialogue like this and, creating safe spaces for people to be able to hold space inside of themselves where they can speak their truth, and maybe people who are non-Indigenous can further educate other people on how to react during times like this as well, so that people who are aware, and if you're surrounded by people who are acting out of line, to be like, hey, this is a really tender moment for Indigenous people, let's have some respect. So I'm optimistic for this kind of dialogue opening an avenue and a pathway to make that happen.
I'm going to jump in just to build off that, because I think, I sometimes call it like the Star Trek effect. How in Star Trek, it's just like 4 centuries and there's no racism and we don't have to talk about how that happened. We just hand wave it away and everybody's happy now. And that's always the place that people want to go to with social justice work, right? That like, we don't want to do the hard work of getting there. We just want to say, oh, like hand wave it away. It's gone. Get over it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's this question of the role of hope in organizing work, right? On the one hand, there's this kind of artificially imposed idea of hope that every time you talk about these things, people go, well, aren't you hopeful? Well, do you think there's good things about the police? Well, but you must see, like this idea that if you have critique, it's so threatening that we need to immediately soften it or get rid of it, or like, but you don't really mean that, right? So there's that kind of hope. But then of course you cannot do this work without hope. You can't do it if you don't believe in our capacity to win. And one of the things that happens in neoliberalism is it wants you to believe, like the powers that be want you to believe this is a closed system, there's no fighting back, right? That you can try, but your phone's gonna be surveyed. We're gonna be in your home, we're in your community, we're gonna criminalize you, we're gonna pull you off the land, whatever we have to do. And so people start to feel like there's nothing we can do. And then all we can do is maybe fuss with each other on Twitter or something, but there's no point in getting involved in this on the ground work because there's no way through. And we have to resist that. Right? That part of how the system works is by convincing us that there is no resistance and convincing us to become as nihilistic as this system is that kills people every day. A system that we watch in Toronto where we have hundreds of police marching in to remove 17 people from their homes. And those were homes. They are not tents or whatever. They are people's homes and they send in hundreds of police. So there's no money, but there's money to do that, right? And this idea that we cannot resist that. But people went out there. Friends of mine were out there all day for the last 2 days. They got pepper sprayed, they got beaten, they got like people have stitches in their faces, and they did it for each other. They jumped on each other's bodies. They like defended people's belongings because they refused the idea that this could be done. And that is hope. It was violence. It was disgusting. It's dehumanizing. It's all those things that we need to call out, but it was also an act of hope. So just, yeah, very briefly too, you cannot, it's very hard, right? When you're working with people and they're in these absolutely disgusting situations and they're calling you to basically say, can anything be done? And when you have to like deliver that message, like, no, like your appeal's being turned away from the Supreme Court, that you're at the end of the road and I don't know what to tell you, like,
Yeah.
and help you get a lawyer, like it's gone, like nothing, those kind of things. Is awful to like encounter people in that despair, but the hope comes from just, that person's still reaching out, the love that people show each other, the profound love that people have in the most disgusting situations where they fight for each other, where they call your phone and say, there's somebody in here in solitary, he's not being treated right, this is my last phone call, I'm helping him, or, I'm speaking out to so other women won't experience this, like there's an amazing amount of just like the beauty that people have for each other. And so often the people with the least are the ones that just extend the most generosity and the most love and the most care. And that is, to me, what is hopeful. They show us. People living in the worst circumstances show us what a world can look like, that you can be people being evicted and fight for each other. You can do that. You can be people in prison and love each other when you're not supposed to. You can be people being deported and like still be working in your community, giving other people food, So for me, that's where the optimism lies. That was a really long answer. Sorry, somebody else.
No, Meenakshi, I saw you nodding. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I really want to like echo what Hopakawit has noted, that I think for myself, like as a settler living here, what does optimism mean when I like have citizenship in a genocidal country that is devaluing Black and Indigenous people and systematically stealing and annihilating the original caretakers of this land? And I think like, yeah, agreeing, like reframing what optimism means, because like the things that drive me aren't like, I want to get to a place where I can feel optimistic, but I feel like so many people are still struggling to like live.
Yeah.
5 people a day are dying because of a racist, prohibitionist drug policy crisis.
Yeah.
Indigenous folks on the street are being subject to over-policing, street sweeps, displacement from tent cities because of settler colonial imaginations, and who has a right to public space.
And I just want to note this, my son-in-law, because of that, the father of my grandbabies died because of that. They pushed him out of public spaces and he was alone and he had overdosed and they hadn't found his body for a couple of weeks. We just found out about this. So, I mean, these are real things. These are tangible things that happen to us. Like, you're not just talking to somebody, this is my son-in-law, the children, like this is immediate. Every Indigenous person has this story right now. And the thing, with residential school only pushes it further, which is, it's important to note that, like, how can we be optimistic? My grandbabies just lost their daddy because there was any kind of support, and because he was Indigenous, right? All of these things were adding up, and he became, literally just, he died, and now he's just another he's just another number.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for your loss. And,
I do want to say the thing that does inspire me is like being on the West Coast around like Indigenous matriarchs who continue to stand up to power no matter like the consequences, without feeling beholden to like respectability or job prospects, or like the shirt that I'm wearing is a memorial for Harriet Nahaney, who stood up to development just prior to the 2010 Olympics, and was a 71-year-old Indigenous woman residential school survivor who got sentenced to jail for her land defense and died shortly after. I'm inspired by the work that Hopakawit is doing, calling attention to like genocidal institutions that have been hiding in plain sight, like the Royal BC Museum and the Catholic Church and the various orders that operated these residential schools. And Earlier this week, I was with some family members of Jared Lowndes, who was killed by the RCMP in so-called Campbell River. And these were like Wet'suwet'en women who were at the North Vancouver RCMP detachment yelling for the RCMP to stand down. And I think like settler folks, like it's not about optimism for us. It's about like supporting survival and resistance. Because this work is not about me getting to feel good. Like that's you can't put your solidarity work on getting a cookie for doing a good thing.
Yeah, there's no
I just want to take a moment to say you can all unmute your microphones and jump in anytime. I wonder though if we could go to Alicia for a perspective on what it's like to capture and convey these stories to the public.
What I was going to say is this sounds kind of counterintuitive because I work for a mainstream publication and am sort of started off as sort of a traditional crime justice reporter, but I think what I'm optimistic about is that the mainstream media isn't needed in the same, or I don't know if needed is the right word, but that there are many different ways for people to reach people without us getting in the way. In a way, like there are alternative publications that are leading the way and teaching us how to do better work and pushing us to do better work because we have to change and adapt. And the work that pretty much everyone else on this panel is doing can reach people without needing kind of the gatekeeping that exists or existed before. Like it's not necessary in the same way. And I think that's a really important thing. We saw that yesterday and the day before, and in Toronto, when we saw the encampment evictions happening, the amount of information that was coming directly from people who are experiencing that on the ground, that reaches people in a way that, you don't get if you're sort of having to be filtered through a newspaper reporter or a TV news report. And I think that is incredibly helpful and has helped further the conversation around defunding police and all of the other conversations that we've been having. Maybe that's part of the reason that people are actually getting to hear what's really going on in a way that they weren't before. Maybe that's why there was a lot of misinformation or not a lack of understanding about what people go through while they're in custody, because now you can hear directly from people who are in custody. Yeah.
I wonder if Brandon and Jennifer, you could talk a bit about the legal lens on this, because that's been the dominant lens for storytelling around these types of issues that we're talking about. So we have the real lived experience, the impact day to day, someone you actually know and love, something's happened to them, sort of coming up against the law and the justice system. And so, could you each reflect on hope and reality within the contributions that have been made so far?
I think I would pick up on something that Elle said, and that you can't do this work without hope. And my work in this field has largely been about bringing the African Nova Scotian voice into the courtroom and into the process, and that has sort of shaped the arguments that we make in court or how we want the profession to look. And I think we find our moments. A couple of days ago, the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute, it was announced that was funded, and that was a community-based solution that we've been fighting for years. And it's not a new solution. You look back to 1988 when Rocky Jones was standing up in front of the Marshall Inquiry, asking for these things, asking for more funding for Black lawyers, more Black judges, court support workers for Black clients. And to see these things coming to fruition, to me, does provide a little bit of hope. And when a client walks into the courtroom and sees a Black judge and knows that their story will be understood, or when we can get a cultural assessment before the court and someone's complete identity is in front of the court, they don't have to be separated, or that narrative is not erased. to me, that's hopeful. So I think we find our moments, but we do run up against a system that was designed for us to fail, and that's the struggle. So I certainly, what everyone else has said certainly resonates with me, but in the last 5 years, I've been sort of cautiously optimistic about some of the progress that's been made in the legal profession in Nova Scotia. And, Elle might argue the other way on some things, but, from what I see in the courtroom, I see people who look like me, and arguments are being accepted that I want to put forward about race and culture. So there is, from my perspective, something to be optimistic about, notwithstanding the struggle and the work that needs to be done going forward.
Jen?
I can jump in. Thanks, Brandon. I totally agree. I worked on a case last year about the Land Titles Clarification Act, which is a piece of legislation in Nova Scotia that is designed to help African Nova Scotian communities who've been dispossessed of land and, given horrible land when they first settled here. We helped get somebody title to their land, and that's a reported decision. Maybe, I don't know if somebody can look up Downey on Canley and pop it in the chat, but there's lots of good stuff there. So I think, that's a good example of the kind of work you can do from within the system, as Brandon talked about. But I also feel personally like I'm in a moment of questioning everything about the system, questioning, the oath that I swore, and I pledged allegiance to the Queen. Like, that now is kind of mind-blowing to me, looking at the colonial legacy in the system that we all swear that we're going to work to uphold. So those have been, I know we're not talking about getting our cookies like Meenakshi said, but those have been some tough moments for me, trying to question my role within a system and while I'm questioning the system. So one thing that does give me hope is that, you don't always, in a corporate law firm environment where I am, I'm often writing insurance opinions and doing kind of the bread and butter work of civil litigation. You don't often get the chance to do these big social justice oriented client files, but there's so much opportunity to get involved in the community outside of your day job. And for example, the Nova Scotia Policing Policy Working Group that Elle co-founded last year has been one way that I've been able to do that. So I think one source of optimism is that there is an opportunity for everybody, even if you are in this corporate world, to get involved in social justice issues and push this progress forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to talk a little bit about taking that hope and turning it into a strategy. For a long time, for the general public, anything about the criminal justice system has been either, a political context of being tough on crime or having platitudes about progress. I wonder if you could each reflect, separately together on, what's an effective strategy to break out of that kind of binary thinking and advance a sensibility that's about meaningful change, something with nuance. Brandon, I wonder if I can start with you.
Yeah, that question makes me think about, the Morris case in Toronto and Justice Nakatsuru, who gave this decision. And anytime we talk about serious crime, the default sentencing principles are going to be deterrence and denunciation. So we're going to deter you specifically and others from this criminal conduct, and we're going to denounce this unlawful conduct. And so what Justice Nakatsuru did in Morris was take a more nuanced approach to these sort of rigid principles, which are just ideas. The actual analytical data shows us that deterrence doesn't actually work, and people don't like to say that in court. But this is a fundamental sentencing principle, and it's why people go to jail for so long. Yeah. So Justice Nakatsuru took a nuanced approach and said, perhaps society should reflect on, its role in creating these circumstances that led to this person coming before the court. And perhaps we can take a flexible approach to these rigid sentencing principles, focus more on rehabilitation, culturally appropriate programming, view someone through a lens of systemic racism and background factors and how that's impacted them, and arrive at a sentence that's more just fundamentally. And I think to break down these, generational entrenched ideas, that's the type of leadership that you need, but you need people in place who are courageous enough to do that. And so the Morris case has been heard at the Court of Appeal. We have a case with similar issues that's been heard at the Court of Appeal in Nova Scotia. And, depending on the outcome, those are issues that could go up to the Supreme Court of Canada. So that's, to me, how you take on some of these rigid, entrenched principles. And there's a million other ways within the justice system. Think about jury selection. Do we actually need people who are charged with murder to have their case heard in front of a jury? That's mandatory unless the Crown consents to that. And if we acknowledge that there is systemic racism in the system, if we acknowledge that people have implicit bias, anti-Black bias, and you ask, a young African Nova Scotian man to sit in front of a panel of 12 white Nova Scotians and expect a fair trial, we should be reevaluating that process. And if we can't change the question to weed that out of our jury selection process, perhaps, we should think about whether mandatory jury for those types of charges are constitutional. So I think there's a million things that need to be changed, but I focus on the people who are making those change at high levels, like Justice Nakatsuru, like hopefully the Court of Appeal will do here in Nova Scotia. And, that's the sort of community advocacy that we need. And I also recognize my lens as being within the system. And that's hard to accept sometimes. We need people from outside the system, the work of the media, the work of community coalitions. But within the system, I think we select our targets of where we're going to make that change. And that's the sort of work that I get passionate about. So I'm going on a little long. I'll let other people speak, but thank you.
I wanted to pick up on the media piece for a minute, because one of the things we've seen in the media reporting on the encampment destruction in Toronto is that the media keeps describing that as clashes. Mm-hmm. So how are you supposed to bring information to the public when you won't even identify issues of power, right? So hundreds of police show up to evict people from their homes. People stand up and say, you're not going to do this today. We're just going to protect this. They get pepper sprayed and beaten, and the media says clashes. Mm-hmm. Between protesters, as if, this is two gangs, just equal people. And then of course it defaults to the police. So that's a huge problem, right? Part of the problem is that, that's just like one example of the many in which, like, if you can't even present people with the information that's happening, if like your news outlets don't even have the guts to call out what police are actually doing, then how do you expect people to do anything but side with authority, side with the narrative they know, side? So I think, yes, we need much more courageous media in this country. We know why we don't have it, because they're constantly scared of getting like their funding cut or having, white people write in and demand their columnists get fired or whatever. And I think the next important piece to understand is that policing isn't just about policing, right? We have 2,400 surveys that people gave us for this defunding committee to, like, when we were gauging public opinion. And it's very clear from the people who are pro-police that it has very little to do with police. Like, they're not that concerned about crime. Like, they'll sort of cite crime, but they hate Black people. Like, the majority of the content on the, pro-policing is about these people and the Marxists is taking over our society, like personal insults to me, like all this stuff. And I'm like,
it's not about the issue. It's about the person and the color. And that's,
about authority and control, right?
Exactly. So, it's power and control issues, and that's it.
Yeah.
It literally has nothing to do with justice anymore. It's basically just white peopling.
Yeah, and then, Indigenous people don't like the statue. We like the statue. Indigenous people don't like pipelines. I heart pipelines, like literally just a toddler, kind of, throwing their toys out of the, so this is what makes it difficult. And then that's treated as those pointing. The last thing I want to say is that any progress we've made on these issues is generally due to the immense courage of those impacted by these experiences who risk everything to speak out about it. I was talking to a mother yesterday, and she was telling me the story about her daughter, who died in a car accident, but because the police released her from the cells with no way to get home as she was in a psychotic state. And so she took a car and died. And she was recounting to me everything that has happened to her child since her child was 15 years old, and just the failures on and on and on. I mean, we're talking about a 2-hour conversation that this mother talking to me. And I said to her at the end of it, when you go public, I just want to prepare you, people are disgusting. Like, they're going to have everything to say about you. And she said, I don't care. And I'm like, you are so brave, because there will be so many people where your privacy is gone. Your daughter's life will be ripped apart. Your parenting will be ripped apart. And she's like, but the other kids need to know that a mom stands up for their child. And I think, that's just, so I think it's those people who take all of that, get dehumanized, get attacked, get threatened, and are like, I don't care because I'm going to speak the story. And then one other person hears that and they're like, okay, you can speak about these things and speak. So I think most of the progress has come from that. And I know other people want to talk, so go ahead.
And actually, I wonder if you could give us the community advocacy perspective there, because we've seen that there are different kind of tiers or spaces in which you advance the change you can, and then you have the voices speaking up that can. And then could you, from your perspective at Pivot Legal, kind of give us some context around the community organizing side?
For sure. And I think like within Pivot over the past like 2 years specifically, we have had to humble ourselves as an organization that really took pride in like challenging the Constitution, wrestling with inequality through using the charter, and then looking at the law that's been imposed here. So when Amanda Nahaney from Squamish Nation came in and said, there are laws that already exist on these territories, that's not something that we can ignore. To me, the law that's been imposed here colonially can only take us so far. And I see it over and over. I see it as a non-lawyer who supports my peers when they're doing litigation, and we're forced to put people into boxes. We're forced to reduce their identities and their stories into an affidavit that can describe like the horrors that they endure at the hands of bylaw officers, of police, at police dogs' teeth. And I think like from the community advocacy perspective, like what I see is the limitation of the law and also how it is designed to exhaust people who actually want justice beyond a colonial framework. When we're talking about things like people going through the court system, they're like, I don't think we need to confront racism. It's there, right? We don't need to have like a big realization and an aha moment today. I think it's very obviously there.
There's no epiphany.
Yeah.
It exists. It's
you know, here's my black square. Like, you know, the racism exists and is reproduced through the system. So I think, again, like to think about like hope as well, because I see the ways that justice can be produced outside of like BC Supreme Court or BC Provincial Court or Court of Appeal or the Supreme Court of Canada or mediation, because like I watch people go through those processes, discovery, and it's so dehumanizing. Like it's astonishing. And I'm like, we have to get out of these systems, which are like really well decorated cells. We need to get out of them if we really want justice. If we want to talk about people who do harm, we need to actually hold them accountable as a community. And, you know, like even things like murder, right? Like, let's actually talk about why Indigenous women are overrepresented in prison, why they're in the highest security classification, why they are in positions where they have to like literally fight for their life. And we can't resolve that in a murder trial, right? Like those are huge questions about the architecture of Canada. But I want to pass it over to Hopakawit.
Yeah, I'm like, when the thing that I'm thinking about too is like this whole thing is what does justice look like? If we're trying to create conversations about justice outside of a colonial framework, then we have to focus on the fact that it's not Indigenous people who need to decolonize. People are always telling us, you know, like, and we're telling each other decolonize. No. It's only been hundreds of years for us. Everybody else has been colonized way longer than we have, and that is never spoken about, right? Nobody ever talks about that. It's not really us. We're trying to keep all of our things in the forefront. You know, we don't need to decolonize. It's the people who came over here who have been colonized since the March of the Romans that really need to get their act together, and everybody who's disenfranchised then just brought along with them. And then we talk about Black people who are the diaspora and the fact that y'all didn't even want to come here and you were captured, and you know, and let's entwine that. We're talking about justice. What does justice really mean, right? And if we're talking about coming out of a colonial framework, then we need to just dismantle Canada from the roots, right? And how does that look? What does justice look like a Kwamouth person, a Coast Salish person, Kuis, right? What does that look like for us? Are you willing to accept our frames of justice? So when we talk about Indigenous governance, we talk about all of these things and racism and all of these things. So if we govern ourselves and we create our own system based on what we had done for millennia that was working for us, is that going to be accepted? Not only by, hopefully a dismantled governmental system by then, right? So when we're talking about these things, we also like looking at the big picture here and the steps that we're going to create these avenues and these pursuits. And then how also do we just deal with what's happening right now today in terms of with Native people in courts, with what's happening in the jail systems, all of these things. So, I mean, these things are very real and they're tangible, but how do we go about working together to create a framework or even come up with an idea that's cohesive and that we can follow through on and create very real action and without question, right? That's real for me. I have all of my firm ideas about what justice means and how to go about doing it, but not everybody's going to agree. And so, where do we come to that understanding? We're acknowledging territories. I don't care anymore if people acknowledge my territory. I really don't. We get it. Yeah, you know where you live. Thanks. Let's move on now. Right? Where's the next step? We're acknowledging this land. We're not giving it back. That's a form of racism. Everybody who buys a house, especially in BC, with over 240 nations, right? And we only have 2 historic treaties, which is the Douglas Treaties, and then the Treaty 8 up in the Fort St. John area, and all the rest of it is either modern day, which are not even really treaties, and then the rest of it's unceded and unsurrendered. So when we're talking about, we're doing land acknowledgement, and then people say land back, like that actually means give us our land back. Why are you paying the government and the mortgages? So where's the justice in that? That's a form of racism too. Who owns the land that you live on? These kinds of things too, people don't think about it. It's just, well, whatever, I just bought I got a mortgage, or that's crown land or whatever. So, I mean, these are also conversations that we need to have we got to look big picture, little picture, and in between. And also, how does that affect you knowing that you live on these spaces? And meanwhile, my son-in-law is dying in a freaking park because he had nowhere to go. And y'all got the privilege of having homes, right? And all of our people are just, left like garbage and not taken care of. And, where's the justice in that? And where do we go from there? And then, we can say nobody ever just skipped down to Hastings and was like, hey, I want to be homeless. And, let's talk about it. It's not intergenerational trauma, it's generational. The last school that closed for residential schools was in 1997. This isn't intergenerational trauma. This is trauma. That's generational, that's happening right now in all of these spaces. So let's address these issues, right? And hitting with those feelings.
Jen and Alicia, I wonder if you can reflect on how you translate that sense of unlearning, thinking beyond, this binary kind of way. And actually, you use the word non-lawyer, which I caught onto because that also is like an indicator of just how limited the spaces are to make change. Sometimes, like, you're either a lawyer or you're not in the justice system, right? And like, what is not? It's absolutely everybody else, and lawyers are human beings as well. So Jen and Alicia, I'm wondering if you can share a bit about the corporate context and the journalistic context and the changes within those spaces and how, they've been called upon to understand a different level of nuance and really change the standard in terms of, how they demonstrate change or acknowledge change. What's different now, and what are you seeing in terms of strategies to advance the kind of progress we've been discussing today?
Can I just make one housekeeping comment, Sabrina? I noticed that the survey that was put in the chat was actually the survey that our group did for the municipal election in Halifax in October, where we asked a bunch of questions about policing. We haven't published yet our results on the defunding survey, but it's very interesting that many of the councillor candidates who responded to our survey in October ultimately voted to increase the police budget when the time came. So that's a little housekeeping point. I think, in the corporate world, these conversations often just turn into diversity and inclusion committees and sessions. And, there's been so much talk about that. I think today we're here for bigger conversations. So something that I've been thinking about a lot is the lawmaking process itself. And as we've heard over and over today, Indigenous law has often not been taught and not been considered as part of the legal system. And that, to me, absolutely has to change. When we talk about the police, which is kind of my angle coming in here today, we talk about law enforcement. Well, what are they enforcing? Laws. Who made those laws? Humans. Elected federal politicians tell us what crime is in Canada. Law isn't this static thing handed down from on high, but when you walk into law school, you're not necessarily taught to think about it that way. So to even loop this back to the first question, one of the things that gives me hope is that we are seeing more programs like UVic, which was put in the chat earlier, where Indigenous law is taught as law, as it should be. And Schulich Law here at Dalhousie in Halifax also has a new program. So I know it's problematic to talk about integrating Indigenous and colonial systems, but like Brandon said, when you're kind of within that system, you have to work with what you got, and those kinds of programs at law schools that will hopefully teach lawyers from day one to think about law and how we make law differently, that does give me hope. And I do think that might be an effective strategy to go back to the question.
Thank you for the housekeeping item too. We'll make sure that we share that information post-event. Alicia?
I just wanted to pick up something Meenakshi said, which is that we don't talk about why these things are happening. We don't talk about why Black people in Toronto are way more likely to be killed by police officers, or why there is significant overrepresentation of Indigenous and Black people in custody. We don't talk about why, and I think maybe there's some assumed knowledge that everyone knows how terrible it is to be in jail and who ends up in jail and why that happens and who gets bail and who doesn't get bail. But I think that this is like a major failing of the media, and like, I think a lot about sort of the work that I do and how it hasn't done this is that there's a failure to connect these dots and a failure to address like the reasons why this is happening, to like mention the word colonialism when that is a factor in what's happening. Like that's just not something that is done regularly. And it's really easy. Sort of Elle talked about like the institutional narratives, or like working within sort of the police narratives, the police press releases, like not like even just the idea of who is a criminal and who is a victim. Like if you really look, and like Brandon talked about the Morris case, and like you guys call them the RCAs, we call them something a little bit different. And I don't think we've settled on an acronym here, the cultural assessment reports. But those are incredibly helpful to me as a reporter, because those do all the work of connecting all the dots about how systemic racism and specific racism, and like from the educational system through streaming, through like over policing in someone's childhood. I did a murder plea the other day. It was a 17-year-old who killed another teenager in Yonge Dundas Square. And the sentencing report on that child and the life that his life and that what brought him to that point, if people understood that, like I think we would be a lot further ahead, but we're not explaining and we're not giving people that information. We're not doing that work of connecting the dots. And so there has been progress in the justice system to help us do that, which is great, but there also needs to be a much greater understanding among journalists about this stuff, right? Like the TRC recommendations involve that. And if you like look at, I think AP10 actually did a piece about like the progress that we've made, which is very little. We're not doing a good job. And like we need to do a much better job at informing people, because it's not happening.
And the media is so powerful too. I mean, you have the power to actually influence outcomes, and we see most of the time that works against people from our community, but there are certain circumstances where the media, the case that I'm thinking of was person who was a victim of domestic assault didn't want to go to court for a lot of good reasons. I think she was Black and Indigenous, and didn't show up to court. Witness warrant was put out by the Crown. She was held in cells, basically assaulted by the police from what I could tell from that story, but she was charged with assault and resist. And the media and the use of the media by the defense lawyer and the courage of the person to come forward and tell her story actually resulted in the Crown dropping the charges. That public pressure is so powerful. So if we can harness that power to advance some of these causes, I think that's extremely powerful.
Part of what I wanted to add too is that while it's reflected in the media, this is peak white supremacy, right? This is how white supremacy works, the endless claim to innocence. So you know that Onion, there's an old Onion headline that was like, miracle of birth happens for billion trillionth time, and that's like Canada, like shocking thing happens again for thousandth time in a row. And now we're shocked again. What is this? Residential schools are bad?
Oh my God.
And then next tomorrow, who knew? Tomorrow, who knew? Right? Like, so this is part of it.
Groundhog Day with cognitive dissonance.
Wanting to act brand new. And then there's the idea that like media is somehow unobjective to do that analysis of people. So everything gets presented in this atomized way. And that is also court, right? It's such a hard battle to try and bring in evidence about like anti-Black racism or evidence about the child welfare system. Oh, that's not relevant. And I'm like, because you don't want to connect the dots, because that once you connect the dots, you can no longer claim to be endlessly surprised and shocked like at the things that happen all day, every day, that you know are happening, that you legislated to happen, that you sent out the police to make sure they happen, that you stripped our resources so they would happen, that you caused to happen. And then are like, who knew this would happen?
Like, oh my God, there was a consequence for all the shitty things that we did. Yes, honey, that's how that works. There are literally consequences. And I'm just like so beyond frustrated, especially when you consider like the way that Justin Trudeau had an interview a couple of days ago, and his response to the bodies that were found, he's like, well, we knew they were there for generations. And it was like, oh my God, how incredibly uncouth and vulgar was he in that moment, and the expression on his face was just disregarding this, right? Like we've known, they've known, we all know. So like, let's just, and it was just this kind of like flippant way of just like saying, let's get over it. Or like, they knew, we knew, we're doing something. And it was so absolutely disgusting to see like, this is the leader of your country, right?
And it's a split second, right? 1 minute, this isn't happening. You guys are ridiculous and crazy. And then we all know it's happening. Why are you still going on about it? It's obvious. And I'm like, literally not even a breath.
There was no fluctuation. It was like, what? Yeah, it's been happening forever. Oh my God. Have some responsibility. Seriously.
You forgot about taking a knee and holding a teddy bear. That's what caused the realization.
It was so incredibly rude, and so many of us were just like, how disgusting. You're literally going to court and fighting our babies when they're finding our dead babies here. I cannot think of anybody who has more of a mental freaking psychosis right now than Justin Trudeau is going through a break with reality, I swear to God. And, when we think about justice, and I was thinking about my niece, somebody who come from my community of Housed, Chantal Moore. And I've been thinking about that is health and wellness checks. And one of my big things is, how do we help people without harming? And how do non-Indigenous people help Indigenous people who are in crisis without creating an atmosphere where they're going to be harmed? And we really need to think about that, because people who are in positions or working in corporations or lawyers or support people or social workers and all these things, they're thinking, they're following their checklist, X, Y, Z, tick, tick, tick. We did all the things. No, right? You're sending people, wellness checks are death checks. You're literally sending a death squad out to somebody's house, and that's really real. And we have to think about these things, like when we're talking about social justice and all of these things. Let's also include the fact that what are the things that we're doing that are actively creating more harm than helping, and how do we flip that dynamic and flip the paradigm and create a space where, instead of following XYZ as written out in a colonial box, as so you say, or by Robert's rules, or however you guys go about organizing your stuff, figuring it out so that we're helping my people, the Indigenous people, without actively creating situations where they're getting charged, they're getting shot, they're getting killed, or the story is told in such a way that even though through no fault of their own, they ended up assaulted or dead. And it gets switched to like, you know, they were erratic. And, you know, of course, because every Indigenous person, every time a police car drives by, I'm not intimidated, but I'm like on my guard, because you never, ever know. She came to your door and got shot 5 times. So let's think about these things too, right? Like where do these conversations go, and how do we create more safer spaces so that we're helping people that we're talking about?
Well, I want to pick up on the element of connecting the dots and safer spaces. We have a question from the audience that's come in, and it asks the participants, could you please talk a little bit about how you see the idea of punishment as the default way to address harm?
Well, I have a poster beside me that literally says abandon punishment. So that's where I'm at. I think that, like, you know, even in Brandon's remarks, he noted that like deterrence doesn't work. And what does punishment mean? And I think like there are consequences for harmful actions, and there do have to be consequences, but how they're held and how they are meted out is not through like custodial sentence. Abandoned punishment poster. Yeah, I love it.
I gotta look at it right now.
That captain is like on it.
It's like this, it's so fast.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So
Loving it.
like I think punishment isn't like helping people. It's not particularly preventative. Like if we want to look at the ways to like stop harm. So okay, like I live in Lotus Land, but really it's just like a lot of like yuppies who have colonized and recolonized and recolonized here. So people like will lose their shit over bikes, right?
Yeah.
If you feel like a Vancouverite's bike, you're basically like the lowest form of human. And people like fixate on these like petty property crimes, and it just like it makes no sense. I think people also need to reframe their attachment to like material belongings. And like I'm thinking about this because last night I learned about someone named Yannick Lepage who died at Surrey pretrial after being found unresponsive in a cell. And he was an Indigenous man who was just found dead a week ago. He died in hospital. And when his family finally found him in the hospital, he had been like shackled to the bed. This is someone in the ICU, and he was still like cuffed to a bed. That's just the level of punishment that is like part of the Canadian carceral consciousness. But
Yeah.
I did a little bit of Googling. This guy had like stolen some guitars from 5440. And like to fucking die, to be murdered by the Canadian state because you stole some B-list Canadian band's guitars.
Yeah.
It's just so
5440?
beautiful. Yeah. Like
Hashtag cancel 5440.
5440 better be sending to his family's GoFundMe. But you know, like when we think about punishment, like that is literally like how things cascade, right? You get mad about property crime in your neighborhood, you ask for increased police presence, you ask for community policing centers. So what does that bring? Increased police presence.
Yeah.
Who do the police target? Well, Black, Indigenous, poor people who are like working in illegal economies, often people who have like administrative warrants, who don't want to go to court, right? Like we heard, people really don't want to go to court. It's not a good experience. It's not the thing we were told it was in civics class. People don't go to court. They rack up these warrants. Suddenly they're taken into custody. They're in pretrial, trying to organize their life. It's not like life was great before they went in. They were like obviously doing petty crime to survive, and then like die in jail over like an index offense that's like so meaningless. Is like, to me, that is what punishment looks like in the Canadian context. And of course, people want to talk about, well, what are you going to do about serial killers? I don't know. What are we going to do about the Catholic Church? Tell me.
I would like to know what we're going to do about Canada, because it's a really big serial killer right there. Let's talk about that. Why are we not freaking arresting Justin Trudeau for harboring rapists and murderers, literally? And that's an accomplice to murder. Genocide is a war crime. It's a crime against humanity. UNDRIP clearly states these things. So I mean, like, let's go there, to be honest, right? Because these are real. I mean, this guy, all I heard in the news, the poor man who died in Campbell River, I think, Wet'suwet'en, and all I heard in the news was police dog dies because of whatever. And then when I heard the real story, I was like absolutely astounded that a dog's life meant more than an Indigenous person. A dog's life was reported. Yes, okay, sad face. What about that man and his whole entire family and generations of impact that this is going to happen to? Completely dehumanized.
And also, dog asked to be a cop. So like, stop drafting animals into your colonial state. Like, and there's a long history of animals. Sorry to get on this, but there's like this is part of the labor history, right? Like, animals are fellow workers, right? Like, animals work. And so they're actually part of the working classes. So when you're drafting an animal to be a cop, it didn't get a choice. And then when it dies, you're like, oh, it was an officer. I'm like, it's not an officer, it's an animal.
You're basically, it's like, what are those called? Indentured, like an indentured servant, basically. You do your time and then hopefully you get to retire, but if you die on the way. But I mean, how are we discussing a dog's life when this human's life meant so much? And how is that reported? Like, I want to ask the reporter how
That's what I wanted to do as well. I actually
how is that happening? Like, how are we not reporting on these very important things? Like, let's talk about the disparity and the responsibility. I'm a writer, and an author, and like, where does the responsibility lie for somebody who is a in these positions where you can share these stories and do, and like, where does the social responsibility come in to say, you know what, I actually want to counter this, because we shouldn't like take your cohorts to task, right? Like, why are we reporting about the dog's death when there was a very real human being there? And let's delve into that too, because these are very important questions, because it's systemic, and it's all across every line of work that people are doing, from law to reporting to people like me who does everything because I have to, and then to grassroots organizations, to NGOs, which are mostly harmful. But like, I mean, this is like a whole, it's a big old mess, and how are we going to untangle that?
And we know that journalism has been having a reckoning for a long time, but in particular over the course of the pandemic. I'm wondering, Alicia, we're not looking at you to and the entire sector, but
not all reporters.
I wonder if you've seen a shift in how readers approach issues of punishment and justice, if there's been a change in understanding of systemic inequality among your readers. Has there been a shift there? And then perhaps after Alicia, we can go to Brandon and Jen for the legal view.
Off the top, I think like one of the issues with journalism at this present time is like the sort of funding and like the closure of local news outlets and local journalism, and like just one of the reasons that this despicable reporting, like just the complete lack of reporting about what actually happened. Part of the reason that happens is because people literally don't exist to like go to like the scene and like go and like talk to people about what they saw. And that's why in some ways like technology and like the lack of like reducing the sort of gatekeeping function of media is really important, because that information comes out in other ways. It comes out through people's cell phone videos, and it comes out through people from the community speaking out and not needing to like go to a reporter to tell a story, but just be able to go online and talk about it themselves. We saw that with Regis Korchinski-Paquette, we saw how sort of, her family was able to say what they wanted to say directly, which I think is incredibly necessary. But that's not the only reason. The other reason is obviously media is like enmeshed in like power institutions, and there's lots going on there about who's in charge and who's making decisions. But I will say, like, I agree that the way we tell stories is really powerful. I did it, and like we are getting better. Again, in my optimism, I think there's a lot of really young, talented people of color who have lived experiences, who come from the communities that they're reporting on, who are like driving the conversation forward. I was just reminded of a story that I did last year about a young man who, speaking about punishment, he was for some reason sentenced to a federal sentence for a first-time offense involving dealing drugs, but it was like he was also a drug user, and it was a very harsh sentence for something like that. He was sent to a federal institution. He was released on parole, and his mother, shortly before he was released, his mother sent me an email and said, "I'm worried. There's COVID. I'm worried about my son. I think he's going to die." Mm-hmm. And 6 weeks later, after he was released on parole for the third time, he did die mm-hmm. of an overdose. And when I went back and I looked at all the records from the institution, I learned that the first time he was released on parole, he was released on a condition not to use drugs. That was part of the parole program that he was on. And he did mm-hmm. because it happened and he was going through a lot. And of course, it happened. He went to his parole officer and said, "Look, I need help. Can you help me? Can you help me get into a program? What resources are available?" That's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
And they arrested him, and he woke up. They arrested him. They sent him back. He got released again. He overdosed again. He woke up in the hospital, cuffed to the bed in the hospital. And meanwhile, this was all last year while there was COVID in the institutions, and we were supposed to be having a more compassionate approach.
Yeah.
And is that punishment? Is that an appropriate punishment for somebody? And are we actually thinking about the other side of it, which is rehabilitation, and not the sort of coercive rehabilitation that sort of the drug laws that we have create? They think it's rehabilitation to force someone to have a condition that says you can't use drugs, but that's not it. Are we actually doing anything to actually set people up for success at any point, when all you've done is saddle someone with a criminal record and they won't be able to get housing or a job unless they have previous connections or family money or something? What have we actually achieved?
Yeah.
I think the COVID point is really important. Sorry, I just interrupted.
No, please go ahead, Jen.
And Ellen Brandon can correct me on the stats, but early in COVID, Nova Scotia released, I think, was it 40% of folks in provincial jails? Nothing bad happened. The sky did not fall, crime did not increase. Folks were given wraparound supports. Obviously now funding has been withdrawn and we're back kind of in crisis mode, and the numbers went up again. But for a brief moment, yes, thank you. Article in the chat, right on cue. Yeah. For a brief moment, we decarcerated and it worked. So I think, we can't divorce the concept of punishment from how we punish. And we're seeing, especially during COVID, the conditions inside these institutions of punishment that we have in Canada, jails and prisons. And I was just looking up the status of the constitutional challenge to administrative segregation, solitary confinement in Ontario. And there was a successful challenge to that was supposed to go to the Supreme Court of Canada, and then the Crown withdrew its appeal. And Brandon, I'd love to know what you think is happening in practice, because that seems like a great victory, but I always wonder, coming at this as a civil lawyer, watching from the outside, is that a hollow victory? So what are you seeing in terms of the solitary confinement issue?
Yeah, what we hear from our clients is much different than anything you'll get in terms of answers from correctional staff. We hear from our clients that the prison is understaffed and people don't want to come to work due to COVID, and that leads to what is essentially segregation for everybody. And Elle could speak to it a little better than I could probably about conditions in the prison. but it's happening, it's ongoing, and unfortunately that's an area of the law that gets ignored by not ignored, but doesn't get enough resources from Nova Scotia Legal Aid and private practitioners in terms of habeas corpus applications and prison law in general. And I think it's an area that we need to do better in. And I just wanted to go back to the earlier question about punishment, because I tend to look at things simplistically, and that's not to disregard the complexities of the law, but a lot of people have this idea of good and bad. You're good if you follow the rules, you're bad if you break the rules. And what's the point of punishment and jail sentences? Supposedly to keep public safety, right? To keep the public safe. But if we're not addressing the underlying issues, the root causes, the substance use issues that Alicia talked about, it doesn't matter. What are you expecting to happen in jail if, first of all, you don't have the programming to support these goals anyway? And second of all, we're sending someone to jail who should really be addressing the substance use issue or the adverse childhood experience that led to the trauma that most of our clients suffer. These are people with trauma that are coming to court, and that's how we need to treat it. So, this idea of punishment, good and bad, long sentence, and a long sentence is based on those things that I talked about earlier, deterrence and denunciation. That's why people get long sentences, because we say this is the law. Court of Appeal says you should get 2 years if you're dealing drugs, even if it's your first time. We don't necessarily, and this is starting to change, but we don't necessarily care about your mitigating factors or your background. You're still going to get that because the law says you should. That's not a really good reason to send people to jail for a long time. And what's happening in jail, and what do we expect to happen in jail, and what do we expect those people to do when they come out of jail? More importantly, how do we transition back into community when we haven't had programming for years? So, I just think everyone needs to shift their frame on that.
And, Deborah Parks has shown that, the life sentence came in Canada, obviously, when we abolished the death penalty, and the initial life sentence is like 7 to 10 years. And then, of course, somebody got out on parole and there's, killed somebody. So there's a big campaign. This is how law gets made in Canada all the time. Right? Everybody freaks out. We need to change parole. And now the average life sentence is like 18 years in Canada, up from 10. So what do you think if you can't solve something in 7 to 10 years, suddenly 18 years, now this person's suddenly not a risk? Like, how does that work if you can't do it in 10? Like, it doesn't make any sense. So part of the problem with punishment, and this goes to prison conditions as well, is there's always an idea of a new normal, right? That today's harsh punishment is tomorrow's normal punishment is the next day's soft punishment. And then people want more. So one of the things is like racialized people that we have to resist is this push on hate crimes, for example, right? This idea of, Bissonnette, he killed, and obviously, like, he killed Muslim people worshiping. It's obviously he's a white supremacist. Obviously he's a terrorist. But I don't think the solution to that is 5-6 life sentences, because we know that the next people, they'll catch 1 or 2 white people, and it will be Indigenous and Black people that get enhanced sentences. Dangerous offenders, 30% of male dangerous offenders are Indigenous men. And like literally every woman that's ever been a dangerous offender, except I think 1, is an Indigenous woman. And none of those women committed a violent crime before they were labeled dangerous offenders. Right. So when we increase a punishment regime, often it's done off our backs. Like, don't you want hate law? You're a woman. Don't you not want serial killers? Well, you don't want rapists running around. Right. And then, of course, it never gets applied. In the case I was talking to the mom, and I don't believe in prison. Right. But this girl was raped as a child. Her pedophile rapist got house arrest. And then this girl, through her life, had served years and months in jail for being traumatized. So you don't even equally apply that, right? My sister's a lawyer, and she's like, whenever I have, she does defense, and she's like, if I have a, child porn case or something, I hope the judge is a man, because he probably looks at porn too. Like, it's like literally, that's not different. Like, we pretend that this system arbitrates something, and it doesn't. And of course, crime is an artificial category created by people in power in order to shore up their values, which is why if you shoplift pop from Walmart, you get punished. But if you steal everybody's trillions of dollars in the banks, then you get promoted, right? So crime is a false category.
Yeah. And just when I think about that too, it's like the disparity, right, between, what do we consider crime? And, there's obviously two ways of it. You got your white crime, and then you got everybody else, like the Indigenous people, right? Where, and I want to know, like, my question, I'm sorry, I forgot your name. The lawyer, the civil rights lawyer.
Jen.
Jen?
Jen.
No.
Oh, Brandon.
Brandon,
Yeah, Brandon.
you know,
I don't deserve that title. Brandon gets that title.
yeah, no, well, because I'm trying to like scroll through and find the name, right? But I'm just curious, like, do you know about like the Gladue principle and things like that? I wanted to bring that up because I think that's really important. Is if we're talking about punishment and justice and along those terms, right? I don't know, but yeah, the Gladue decision was really important, and a lot of Indigenous people who are represented in court, even their lawyers or people who are representing they don't even know about it either. And I think we need to be able to remember those things and to bring it up because it was, I think her name was Jamie. She was a Cree woman who had stabbed somebody and was so anyways, out of that came the Gladue principle, and these are things that we're supposed to put into place to be able to like help maybe further make the connections between the trauma, right, that you were talking about, and how come now they're standing in front of this court system. And and that was the whole thing about like that. I thought when I heard about the Gladue decision, I think that was in like 2000 or something, I don't know, about a couple of decades ago anyways. Myself here.
Brandon, it would be great for you to give, if you can, a 1 to 2 minute overview of Gladue and the race impact assessment reports that you have, because we just have that much time left. And actually, I was collecting public questions or audience questions as we were going, but the flow was tremendous. So we can share them with you afterwards. But for now, and for you to respond to, and we'll send some post-event materials as well. But I wonder, Brandon, if you could just do, thank you so much, brief reflection on the impact assessment reports and Gladue and the journey to those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Gladue is a fundamental decision from the Supreme Court of Canada, which essentially Supreme Court of Canada said you have to take systemic and background factors into account when you're sentencing Indigenous people. You have to sentence Indigenous people differently. And that's the fundamental thing that we take from Gladue. And actually, tying back to an earlier discussion, there wasn't a lot of uptake on Gladue from judges for about 12 years. And then a case named Ipoli came out. And the judges said, no, you need to apply this, and you need to apply it even to serious cases. And systemic and background factors can be mitigating. So we are saying to you, move beyond acknowledgement. You have to move beyond acknowledgement and actually apply this to sentencing. And that idea is also found within the criminal code at section 718(2)(e), where it says you should consider all alternatives to custody, especially for Aboriginal offenders, as it's phrased in the criminal code.
Yes.
And that theme is what we've tried to use for impact of race and culture assessments for African Nova Scotians and African Canadians. We're not appropriating from the Indigenous experience. There's no hierarchy of oppression, right? These two realities can exist at the same time.
Yeah.
And what the idea is to bring that voice, those systemic and background factors, into the courtroom, into the sentencing process, and tell the judges, apply this to the sentence, move beyond acknowledgement, and sentence African Canadians and African Nova Scotians differently. So that's the framework that is used to create the assessments, but it's a landmark case, and it's something that we actually do fairly well here in Nova Scotia. Not all provinces do it well, but in Nova Scotia we have the Mi'kmaq Legal Support Network, and they are the Gladue writers, and every person of Indigenous ancestry will get a Gladue report unless they waive it, and that is understood. And that's where we're trying to get to for African Nova Scotians and African Canadians. Every person, I believe, who is sentenced and has that ancestry should have the right to that type of report, and because it's who you are, it's your identity, and you can't erase that from the process. So I wanted to comment on Gladue.
Thank you. That was excellent. Well done. We're very well done.
I was wondering if I could just make a comment around like Gladue for folks who aren't familiar with it. I think one of the issues is, and it sounds like it's also similar with the report that Brandon was just describing, is that it's something that happens as part of sentencing. So people are already like ensnared in the criminal justice system. And so Gladue will influence like the sentencing decision, but it doesn't actually like get people up out of like criminal justice sentencing. And that's like one of the funny things about like the way that like Canadian colonial law is done, is that everything in the Gladue report really informs why someone shouldn't be punished or found guilty of the offense, but it's not like, it's the timing of it is such that like you're already part of the system. Like it doesn't free you from a record. It doesn't free you from the consequences associated with a criminal record. And I think that that's like, as we like double down on addressing racism within the criminal justice system, we also have to like resist co-optation, and like the co-optation that happens through the law, which is around like using the thing, you know, like the law, police, prisons, like they also pay attention to like our dialogue in these spaces, and they're always going to adopt like the most liberal possible interpretation, right? So they're like, okay, racism bad, overrepresentation in the prison bad. Gladue hasn't actually prevented or ended like overrepresentation, right? We have 25% of people, 30% of prisoners in so-called BC are still Indigenous. And I think like we also have to push the law to actually be effective at the things it's saying it's doing, because while that like pre-sentencing report can be useful, especially for folks who don't have like a long record, the more traumatized you are, the more contact you have with the system, the less kind of like benign oversight you get, like the harder the punishment gets, even though really, if you step back and looked at the situation, you'd be like, wow, putting people in jail through an intermittent life sentence isn't actually working. And we've read the Gladue, we've seen like your life story. Why do we keep doing this to you? And I want to bring it back to the story of Jared Lowndes, who was killed by the police, because he was stolen from his family over and over and over, most finally with like multiple gunshots to the face. And so when we know that people are stolen through residential schools, through foster care, through youth justice, then through mental health, psychiatry, adult criminal justice system, like these like reports that come later on as they've already been forced through the system, like don't get them more free. And that's not to like negate the potential and the importance of getting people like through the system as minimally harmed as possible, but like once someone's found guilty, it's like so now you have a record.
There's very briefly, there's another Nakutsura decision. I can never remember the name of but it's a woman, and he sent.
Oh no, sorry. No.
You know which one it is I'm talking about?
No, I know Jackson and Morris, but you're talking about.
Yeah, and then there's another one before that, and it's I just can't remember. I'm blanking on the name, but it's an Indigenous woman, and he actually says, "I'm just going to send you home," you know, and literally is like, "I'm not sending you," and it's actually the most beautiful decision because he ends with about 3 paragraphs where he says, you know, home can be like a tent, it can be a street corner, it can be, but it's where you feel safe and protected. And he's like, your home is being taken from you. And he's like, I know what home means to me. Like I was in Japanese internment camps in my family. And then he ends the decision by saying like, I'm sending you home. So it's actually a really good example of what a judge can actually do to refuse punishment, right? And Nakutsuru has made all these decisions all over the place where he's literally resisting the system and saying, you know, I'm not going to do those things. I'm not going to impose those sentences. I'm not imposing those kinds of minimums. I'm not imposing those penalties. So I encourage people, if I could remember the name, but look up his decisions. It's a really, really great decision. And so that's also like the point being here that you also don't have to follow through. Like if you have factors and you're like, but I'm still going to do this thing anyway, you actually do have the option to say no sentence. A judge did that in Manitoba. I'm not sending you to jail. And of course, like the Crown appealed, but they were like, I'm not sending more Indigenous people to jail. Like you've changed your life. I'm not sending you to jail. And people are really mad about it, you know, because they just got really invested in punishment and even overriding a judge.
They should spend the rest of their lives in jail. Like that kind of outrage. And it's just, it's highly inappropriate for what people have gone through that led them up to that thing. And when I was thinking about Gladue's, my husband was one of the first people who actually he was the first person that they used that for, and he was facing all of this time in jail. And we were, you know, back in the day when we were younger, and it really worked for him. And he talks about it all the time, and you know, like how it changed his life. He could have been in jail, like, you know, for 10 years and came out and just, you know, who knows, or died in there. But because of these very important things that are happening that people don't even know about. So I mean, that's why I mentioned it. I want to bring it to the forefront. Thank God that he's here now, like, right? And these things are important, and a lot of Indigenous people and people of color, they don't realize what the rights are. How do we make that more forefront and in the public eye, so that when things do happen, they know that they have these support systems back there that are actually in law, that are decisions that are held up by the Supreme Court? How do we make that more accessible for people who are disenfranchised and living off of, out of their communities, or have no support systems?
Well, I'm very grateful for these closing remarks. Thank you so much. We have to leave it there. Obviously, there's so much more for us to talk about, and I hope we do get to continue. I'm very grateful for all of the time and energy and your contributions today. Thank you so much, everyone. There have been some real powerhouse insights, and to have them in this collective group is really tremendous. So thank you all so much. I'm going to turn it over to Adele now to wrap us up, and just a quick super acknowledgement of the chat captain, who has been on fire.
Well done. Guys, thank you so much. This really meant a lot to me, and I was really excited about doing this. And I want to share a little anecdote, because what I really don't know how to thank you for is the emotional labor that you put into every day doing your work. And I want to say I was really inspired to do this event because I knew a man who spent 7 years in prison unduly due to colonial influences.
Yeah.
But about 50 years later, his daughter got the opportunity to be able to host a doubling down event on enhancing dialogue on criminal justice. So we started this conversation on hope. And we think about the next generation. Well, guess what? Hi, I was born in 96. I am that next generation, and we're here, and we don't forget. It is not forgotten, and there are shoes to be filled, and we're here to do it. So thank you for everything you guys have done to bring it forward to this point, and know that your baton is being passed to good people. But I want to end this off with a quote, actually, from Zandeshe Brown. And I dream of never being called resilient again in my life. I am exhausted by strength. I want support. I want softness. I want ease. I want to be amongst kin and not patted on my back for how well I take a hit or for how many. Thank you. Guys, I am with the Morris J. Wosk Centre for Dialogue. My name is Adele.